Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Bell. I'm the Vice President of Programs at World Monuments Fund, or WMF, as you will hear us refer to ourselves. And it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event. This is part of WMF's On My Watch series, exploring projects at sites that have been included on our World Monuments Watch. And the World Monuments Watch is a program that brings together communities from across the public and private sectors to safeguard irreplaceable cultural heritage. Today, we're taking a closer look at WMF projects to rehabilitate historic water management systems as a way to tackle water insecurity in South Asia. I'm sure many of you will know that reliable water supplies around the world are at risk. And water shortages today represent a significant challenge everywhere. Many countries have large numbers of people who do not have regular, reliable access to clean water. The United Nations currently estimates that in 2030, 1.6 billion people, billion with a B, will lack safely managed drinking water. 2.8 billion people will lack access to safely managed sanitation, and 1.9 billion people will lack basic hand hygiene facilities. South Asia already registers, unfortunately, alarmingly high levels of water stress. In 2019, the region registered water stress levels of over 75% compared to an 18.6% global average. And these percentages represent the amount of water taken out as a share of the renewable water supplies available. So this is a very high percentage of water that's being used. As climate change and growing populations, among other challenges, undermine the reliability of modern water supplies, more and more, the importance of traditional water provision and management systems is coming to light. And here, World Monuments Fund is in a privileged position to act. By studying the historic water management systems that exist across the region, and when possible, rehabilitating them, we can have direct impact on the water available to communities at risk. The opportunity to get involved in this area came to us through the 2020 World Monuments Watch, with the nomination of the historic water systems of the Deccan Plateau in India. And this nomination highlighted the traditional step wells, water storage tanks, and often complex systems of underground channels that served communities across the subcontinent for centuries. While many of these systems are still viable and represent a key tool for water storage and provision, they're often poorly maintained or even in some cases abandoned. After including these sites on the watch, WMF explored opportunities to rehabilitate these systems as significant cultural elements that can also play a role in water provision. This led to the launch of our Historic Water Systems of India project in early 2022. And you see an image of some of the sites that we'll be working on as part of this. This is a major initiative supported by TCS Foundation to locate and assess the potential for reviving historic water systems, and when possible, to move forward with rehabilitation. The 2022 World Monuments Watch built on this momentum and highlighted two additional sites that demonstrate the potential of rehabilitating traditional water infrastructure. First, a network of traditional public water fountains known as Hitis in the Kathmandu Valley of Nepal, which led to an ongoing project that we'll discuss today. You see an image, an example here of one of the Hitis. And second, to an intricate series of pre-Inca dams, reservoirs, and channels across the Andes of Peru. These systems were built to divert, filter, and retain spring water and glacier melt for irrigation, use for livestock, and also for human consumption. All of these projects highlight the incredible and very real impacts that cultural heritage preservation can have in addressing one of the greatest challenges facing the world today, diminishing access to clean water. And I look forward to exploring the relationship between water, communities, and heritage with our three distinguished panelists. So let me start by introducing Jharna Joshi. Jharna is an architect and visiting associate professor at Kathmandu University. She has more than 20 years of experience in architecture, conservation, tourism, and teaching around the world, and is a heritage and infrastructure specialist. And she's closely working with us as a consultant on our Hitis project in Nepal. So hello and welcome, Jharna.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm really honored and happy to be in this group and look forward to hearing from all the panelists as well as the participants.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to have you, wonderful to have you. So now let me introduce Yaaminey Mubayi. Yaaminey is an historian and author of 2 books, including the recently released Water and Historic Settlements, The Making of a Cultural Landscape. She has worked in the area of cultural heritage and community development for the past 20 years, and is working with WMF to lead our community engagement activities at the project to rehabilitate water management systems in India. So welcome, Yaaminey. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mohan Rao. Mohan is principal designer and at Integrated Design, and an environmental design and landscape architecture professional, passionate about the intersection between landscape architecture, ecology, and sustainable development. And Mohan, of course, is a key part of the team carrying out our work in India. So hello and welcome, Mohan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pleasure to be here and really looking forward to an engaging discussion.
So thank you all for being here. And just before we jump into conversation, because I do want us to do that, I do want to let all of the participants know that we will have a question and answer session at the end. So we ask you to please, as questions come up, I think there's going to be a lot of good engaging conversation and probably a lot of questions and even points of clarification that people want. So please put them in the chat section or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will do our best to get to them at the end. So let's get started and let's jump into this wonderful content. And I thought before we really kind of jump into the more technical aspects and what these projects look like and how they'll work, thought it'd be really important for us to take a broader look at the role of water in across history and across communities in South Asia. So wonderful to look at its influence on things like politics, economics, and of course, society as a whole. And Yaaminey, your recent book deals exactly with this and the evolution of water and historic settlements. So could you tell us a little bit about how you've seen that water shapes human settlements and the way we live?
Thank you, Jonathan. I hope I'm audible. Thank
Yes.
you very much for having me share a few experiences working with communities. So let me just jump right into what water means at the subcontinental level in India. The Indian subcontinent's relationship with water has been a paradoxical one. On one hand, you have several large perennial rivers, heavy monsoon rains that often cause floods, and substantial groundwater reserves. So India is not exactly a water-scarce civilization historically. Yet, these rich water reserves are not equally or regularly accessible to people across the country's diverse geopolitical landscape. The seasonality of the monsoon, the glacier-fed rivers concentrated in the northern plains, all this has created pockets of water scarcity, and droughts are as common as floods. The dearth of a continuous water supply has led to a fascinating preoccupation with the element among communities, reflected in ritual, poetry, art, and architecture across several millennia of the subcontinent's history. For example, after the blazing heat of summer, the first drop of monsoon rain is an epiphany, described by the Sanskrit poet Kalidasa in the 4th century. It lingered for a moment upon her eyelashes, I quote, struck her lip, burst into spray upon falling on her breast, and then slid over the folds of her stomach, coming to rest at her navel. The first drop of monsoon. Can we move to the next slide, please? So important is water to the Indian landscape. Its association with historic sites and precincts is celebrated in art and painting. This painting of the landscape at Ellora Caves by Thomas Daniels in 1803 highlights the river Yale Ganga as it flows past the caves, forming a spectacular waterfall before joining the mighty river Godavari further downstream. In my recent book on water and community settlements in the Ellora and Daulatabad region, I have explored a range of water bodies that show the local community's initiative and innovation in tapping into scarce water resources. From baulis, step wells that access groundwater, to talabs, accumulated rainwater runoff collected at the base of the tabletop plateau hills, water harvesting cisterns alongside the Ellora caves, to the imperial hydraulic structures constructed by the great dynasties that ruled the Deccan, the Yadavas, the Tughlaqs, the Bahmanis, and the Nizam Shahis. All these show a very complete relationship between human settlements and the landscape, and the leveraging of geographical and ecological features in capturing scarce water resources, storing and managing them. Water is a great public need, and provision of water has historically been seen as a public good of the highest order. Every temple, every mosque and Sufi dargah, every fort and palace is associated with water bodies, and every ruler over the past 2 millennia of the region's history has added his own chapter in this regard. May we move to the next slide, please? Speaking about the community's role in constructing and managing historic water structures, I would like to recount to you a personal experience of discovering a medieval water system in Daulatabad. I had read about an elaborate system of transporting water from a 12th century tank to Daulatabad fort, a system of 3 cascading lakes, one flowing into the other, running through a deep gorge about 2 kilometers northwest of the fort. It was built in the 17th century by Malik Ambar, the Ethiopian general who ruled Daulatabad fort at that time. I was standing on the edge of the tank, trying to figure out where this system was and what it looked like, because all around me were simply fields and some rocky outcrops covered with brambles. An elderly gentleman was sitting at the edge of the water, tinkering with a pump. He saw me pass up and down in perplexity and finally called out, "What are you looking for?" I was slightly annoyed at the distraction. So I muttered something about, "I'm looking for some old structures, water channels." "Are you looking for Malik Ambar's pipeline?" he asked. I was flabbergasted that he knew who Malik Ambar was, and more so about his water system. "Yes, do you know where it is?" I asked. Then over the next several hours, he patiently explained the hydraulic valves that were used to extract the water from the tank and transport it over the undulating countryside. Ignoring the hot sun beating down and the thorny brambles underfoot, I followed him across the 2 kilometers of the dry beds of the cascading lakes. As he pointed out, remains of ceramic pipelines, running streams, and a waterfall that supplemented the supply to the fort. He basically showed me, uncovered the entire water system. We sat in the shade of fruit trees that were part of an orchard planted by Malik Ambar to encircle and protect the water system. He showed me an ancient banyan tree that he said was the dargah of a Sufi saint who protects the orchard. Dargah is a shrine. It was a tree. We drank cold water from the waterfall that he and his friends would play in his childhood, he told me. The entire landscape came to life when I saw it through the eyes of one who had lived there all his life. He told me his name was B.D. Shah and that he was a farmer with fields nearby. 5 years passed before I could go back and try to meet him again, but he had passed away. and I was left with the precious memories of that day we had spent in Malik Ambar's pipeline. I later nominated Malik Ambar's pipeline to be listed on World Monuments Watch as one of the Deccan water systems. May we see the next slide, please? There was a wholeness to my experience of Malik Ambar's pipeline that went far beyond archival research, discovering dates and names, analyzing hydrological data, looking at architectural forms. I lived the experience that afternoon. And what brought it to life were the emotions, the sense of peace and sacredness under the Banyan Dargah, the thought of two boys frolicking in the waterfall on a hot summer day. That sense of the simple joy of water and childhood completed my journey of research on water and communities in Ellora and Daulatapur. This is an image of Dharma Talab, a significant water body in the region. It is a gathering place for women washing clothes and filling pots for the home. At one end, you will find buffaloes submerged, soaking in the life-giving fluid, as also young men vigorously scrubbing goats and cows. I couldn't resist this image of children diving off a wooden bridge, enjoying a swim in the water. It is an entire ecosystem catering to the lives and livelihoods of the local communities. But never forget the recreational aspect. Water is a source of life, but also a source of joy. People told me that the new government had provided piped water supply from a large hydroelectric project 40 kilometers away. However, they said the piped water supply came in only once a week for 1 hour. How are we to exist on that? They said. So it was the talabs that provided them with subsistence even today. The talabs are critical even today. To conclude, I feel that in order to understand what water means to the community, we must spend time, build trust, and experience their lives by walking in their shoes. Everyone may not be as generous as Mr. B.D. Shah, who opened his life to a stranger. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yaaminey. It's a great way for us to see some of the way that water is, the role that water plays throughout society and culture in South Asia, but really I think everyone around the world can relate to a lot of those stories. And I really love that you highlight the importance of local knowledge and that community engagement, because often they know much more than any of us coming from outside about where these things are and how they've been used. So I want to move on now to get into slightly more of the technical aspects and ask Mohan to talk to us a little bit about some of the types of infrastructure that we see across South Asia, and also begin to talk a little bit about our project in India and what we're going to be doing. Over to you, Mohan.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, the work that we do, it's a research-based practice whose focus is largely environmental issues, but of course, water is very, very central to that. And as we can see in the slides that will come up, the range of geographies that has taught us so much about the water, and this is not limited just to South Asia, but across the globe, moves anywhere from 100 millimeters a year to 11,000 millimeters a year. And the next slide, please. The real irony is that each of these geographies face the same scarcity of water. So it's not the amount of precipitation, it's not the glacier melt, it's not the monsoon that determines the availability, but the way in which it is managed and what has been managed across eons. In many of these cases, it spans several millennia of local knowledge. And what you said about the local knowledge is really critical, Jonathan, because in most traditional societies, it is not just the expressed water that catches a lot of our attention, whether it is irrigation systems or the rivers or the tanks, but really the intricate relationship between the natural systems. between biodiversity and soil and water. And like someone put this so beautifully once, that the way in which traditional societies across the world have dealt with soil water or groundwater, essentially releasing them from the tyranny of the expressed water systems, the conveyed water, has really changed and shaped cultures in very diverse ways. We have all seen the grand step wells that Rajasthan and Gujarat is so well known for. But across the subcontinent, one also comes across very beautifully crafted, very local, sometimes at the scale of a single household, the ways in which groundwater is managed. So many of the pictures that we are seeing is simply the before and after of an intervention. Sometimes the intervention is quite extensive across a watershed. Sometimes it's very localized to nurture each of these water systems back to their health. Next slide, please. And some of the most satisfying ways in which this nurturing of the groundwater systems has happened is where the community takes complete ownership of the entire process, everything from design to construction to management. As we can see from these examples from tribal settlements in Ranchi in central India, not only have the water systems been nurtured back to health, this has also made these water structures as celebrated social spaces, because water is so central to their very being. And what this essentially means is that there is a great amount of resilience that is brought back to the community that reduces the dependence on centralized infrastructure services and gives them agency over both the quality and the quantity of water that they can manage. Next slide, please. In many of the cases, it is not only the expressed water, be it the case of a well or a tank, but essentially the way the wetness of water is managed in landscapes. As we can see in one of the driest districts in peninsular India, the way the wetness of the soil is expressed through seasonal tanks to very, very precious deep well, and the way in which it is extracted also means that it shapes the agricultural practice of the larger region. And this linkage is very, very critical to understand, because water should not be seen as a standalone element just valued for the quantity that's available, but its seasonality and the dependence of the larger natural systems in that landscape. Next, please. Sometimes the scale of intervention is much, much larger than the actual tangible expression of the water. What we can see here is the before and after exercise of an intervention to revive an old village tank. But it's not just the tank which spans only a few acres, but the amount of work that actually goes into restoring the larger watershed. In this particular case, it's over 10 square kilometers. And it's the work that is done almost as acupuncture on the landscape. They're not large-scale infrastructural works, but decidedly small interventions, very pointed interventions that helps sustain the larger landscape. And the final expression of such intervention is, of course, the tank itself. Next, please. And like Yaaminey has elaborated earlier on the relationship of human habitation, settlements of every kind across millennia, and the ways in which the water is expressed. Sometimes it's celebrated in a much grander scale. In some cases, it actually becomes very much part of the settlement. Very similar to the case that Yaaminey expanded on, the Daulatabad. This is a geography in central southern peninsular India in Chitradurga, which was a fortified town, and the level of decentralization and the consequent resilience that one can see is just incredible, because it's not only fortified for military reasons, but also in terms of securing the water. So the series of cascading lakes that one sees, and these have been revived not just as an effort for conservation, but also as a means of a public infrastructure, which the citizens continue to depend upon greatly. Next, please. This is one of the projects that we are doing with WMF. This is Taj Baudi in Bijapur. Has a very, very long and complex history. It is not one history, starting from the Chalukyas of the 8th and 9th century onwards and moving on up to the Bahmanis. So what's wonderful about a site like this is that there are several knowledge systems that come together. It is not one or the other. There is a system of understanding the groundwater systems, the way it is conveyed through the karés, which the Persians brought in, but also the traditional systems that predated this technology. And again, the effort here is to not just look at the revival of the water system as a measure of conservation, but as an essential piece of infrastructure that is available to the people in the neighborhood. Next, please. Some of the scales of these interventions vary quite a lot. This is the Rajaon Ki Bauli exercise that is currently being undertaken by WMF, supported by the TCS Foundation. You will notice that while the area of intervention is the orange dot that we see at the bottom, the research and analysis to essentially understand the land and the related systems spans much, much wider. One needs to look at the much larger watershed, the changing land uses that continue to happen, because this is a living, thriving city, and this brings its own set of challenges in terms of how do you exactly leverage ancient knowledge systems to address current day infrastructure challenges. Next, please. Of course, for me personally, as a journey, all of this has kind of come together over the 2 to 3 decades of work that was done in the metropolitan area, city of Vijayanagara, which is the World Heritage Site of Hampi, where several layers of both tangible and intangible expressions of water and the way the occupation of land was actually determined by the way in which water was leveraged is just the most perfect textbook learning of, all the knowledge systems that exist in the subcontinent. Next, please. I think I will conclude here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mohan. And I mean, it's wonderful to see the real diversity and richness of these examples of infrastructure and water management approaches and strategies that, as you rightly note, really go back eons. We have to stop saying centuries. We're talking about thousands of years. And I love a few things I was just jotting down that you touch on that are so important. Cultural aspects of water that, of course, Yaaminey also talked about. The seasonality, which is one of the challenges and the strengths of how we often get our water, right? Of course, the role of locals in management, not just in knowing where things are and some maintenance, but real management decision-making and continued oversight of these systems, which is so essential. And I definitely want to come back to that. And also the differing scales of intervention, both historically and now as we try to address some of these issues. So we're going to come back to a lot of that, but I want to get Jharna into the conversation. And Jharna, I want to turn it over to you so you can talk to us a little bit about the Hitis system across Kathmandu Valley and what it's done for people there, for Well, also at least 1,000 years, right? More than that.
More
And
than that.
yes, more than that. And also how we're hoping to intervene where we can.
Thank you, Jonathan and WMF for highlighting the Hitis of Kathmandu Valley. As you probably know, Kathmandu Valley prospered through the excellent land management knowledge and skills of civilizations that settled on high grounds to leave the fertile floodplains for cultivation, as well as protect themselves from floods and other natural disasters. One outstanding example of their high skills is demonstrated by the traditional water system or the Hiti system that was developed with the excellent knowledge of the physical structure of the valley, which is shaped like a ball, and the available natural resources and the skills of managing these resources. So the traditional water system consists of 5 major components. The intake or the natural water source, which is located in the surrounding hills, the irrigation channels or the large kulo that irrigated the farmlands, the stormwater spouts or the Hitis that supplied water to the urban population, the natural aquifers, the ponds, wells that supported the Hiti system, and of course the drainage system that ended the rivers. So in the next slide, you can see that among these different water architecture, the Hiti, no doubt, is the most elaborate and intricate in design as well as in technology. The earliest of the Hitis found in the valley are located in the Satyanarayan Temple in Kathmandu, which is from 550 AD, and Manga Hiti in Lalitpur, which is from 570 AD. So the construction of the Hiti and large kulo system started in the Lichi period, which in Nepal was from the 5th to the 8th century, and was further developed by the Mallas during the between 13th to 18th century. The Hitis brought drinking water to the urban population of the valley, and we can still find them within 15 minutes of walking distance in every neighborhood. The source of the Hitis, next slide, please. The source of the Hitis are mostly natural underground shallow aquifers or springs that are located near or around the Hiti and linked through a sophisticated underground supply and drainage lines that use natural sand filter system to purify the water as it flows. The pictures you see in this slide are from Nagbal Hiti in Lalitpur that we restored 2 years ago. The inlet channel was made of bricks and is about 12 feet below ground. Small stone or clay balls were placed where the channels bend, and they are filled with sand and pebbles for filtration. At other Hitis, we have seen timber and ceramic pipe-like channels as well. In this slide on the right, you can see the manuscript of the ancient system. In the next slide, please, thank you. Besides functioning as a main source of water for the neighborhood, these Hitis still play a vital role as religious and social spaces, and many of the Hitis are associated with several festivals and other rituals. A guti is a usual setup for the management and maintenance of the Hitis, as well as water distribution. A guti is a self-sufficient social organization, like a trust, established for the maintenance and management of specific structures or functions, and in this case, the Hitis, and it used to be funded by tilling the lands donated. There are also several festivals and traditions associated with the Raj Kulo and the Hiti that are celebrated to bring together communities to appreciate and thank the natural resources. The most important of these festivals related to water system are Sitinaka and Machinanath Jatra. Sitinaka falls in May, just before the monsoon, and is a day dedicated to clean and repair the water system, including the wells, Hitis, and ponds. Machinanath Jatra is the most important festival for Lalitpur, where I'm from, and when the whole city gets together to pull the chariot of Machinanath around the city to bringing a good monsoon and a good harvest that lasts for more than a month. That's the chariot that you see on your top right corner. This unique system is on the World Monument Fund 2022 watch list, and since being on the list, has been able to attract attention both locally and internationally. Most of these cities are still the only source of water for many, especially the urban poor. And the large part of the farmers in the rural areas still depend on the rainwater and the large flow to irrigate their land. WMF is working with the local NGO, Jiva Jaita organization, that nominated the Hitis system of Kathmandu Valley for the watch list. And we are working together to document and update the present condition of the Hitis system, which hopefully will lead to further collaborations to preserve and manage this important heritage. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Jharna. That was really wonderful to be able to see some of the technical aspects of how the Hitis are constructed, how they've been maintained over the years, and of course, some of the design elements that I think capture many of our imaginations for those of us not living in Kathmandu Valley. I want to, as usual, time is rushing along and we're running out of it. And so I want to make sure that we have some time to talk amongst ourselves and get into some of these issues that have come up before we open the floor to questions. And a reminder, please do write your questions in the chat for those attending the event. And one of the things that you all really stressed and highlighted, not only as being an important part of a project, but an important part of why these places are important, not just that they provide water, but they're also centers of community, they're centers of cultural identity and activities. And so I want to talk a little bit about the community engagement piece in the work that we're all doing together and the work that many of you have been doing for years and how that works. So Yaaminey, I thought I'd start with you. I know you're leading this work for us at some of the sites in India. And I wanted to see if you could just tell us a little bit about how you approach this and what does community engagement look like on a project like this? How do you talk to people? How do you approach them? And what questions are we seeking answers to?
Well, Jonathan, it's been my experience that you pretty much have to jump in. Yeah, I mean, plunge in. If I can use the pun, one has to, make contact with members of the local community. A little bit of background work would be helpful on, trying to identify people who are knowledgeable in the local communities, people who are interested, and believe me, they are always there. Right? It's simply a matter of identifying them. In a village, it could be a local school teacher who has, made it his life's work. I discovered one such person in a medieval town called Farooq Nagar, which is very near Delhi. Yeah, I mean, you make contact with these people, and then you need to spend time with them, and then move outwards. This also does not mean that you collect information purely on an anecdotal basis. Okay, it's not a subject. It is a discipline, after all. It's not a subjective, area. So you would be offsetting a lot of information against a lot of archival research that would be done. A lot of consulting, local records, the local government offices, their libraries, their collections, files, old files, district gazetteers, all these sources should be consulted. Ideally, I'm a historian by training. So, my instinct is always to go for the text and the written word. But then you have to move beyond. So you move beyond the written word, and then you need to talk to people. You need to have lunch and dinner with them. You need to spend time and live their lives and learn their problems. And, I've been working, for example, in Ellora since 2008. And those people are like my family now. I mean, they call and they say, I'm having problem with my son, the boy is going astray, and then I sit and be the agony aunt. So, I mean, it's a long-term engagement is what I'm saying.
It is, and I think that's a key point. It is a long-term engagement, a commitment. It's relationship building, right?
It
Always
is.
working with people is about building trust and establishing these relationships. Jharna, could you maybe say a little bit about how we're approaching this in Nepal? And I know all of these projects are really just getting started in many ways. And so how is that going to, what is that going to look like in the Kathmandu Valley?
Because the Hitis, most of the Hitis are located in urban areas. It's a challenging task, no doubt. But at the same time, there's a growing awareness in the importance of the Hiti system, especially when the modern pipelines were running dry and the Hitis were working, at least in the monsoon. Well, there are more than 400 Hitis dotted around the Kathmandu Valley, and most of them have dried up. Some of them are even lost, and some of them are still functioning, some of them seasonally. But at least until now, there is still local knowledge of where some local knowledge on how it functions. So it's important to do something right now, but it's quite challenging. I mean, it's because of the new infrastructure coming in, the rising, increasing density in the cities. But luckily, most within the valley, there's still local communities who are still come together at least once a year or something for the festivals. And the festivals were designed, I think, mostly to bring the communities together. So so the like Yaaminey was saying, you just need to go in, talk to the community, and engage with them for first and foremost before you begin anything technical.
Right.
That's from my experience. Yeah.
Absolutely, and you both mentioned that it's challenging, which is a key part of this as well. We have to recognize that. I did just want to highlight with the work on the Hitis, we have a very unique opportunity because we have a partnership with the Magnum Foundation, World Monuments Fund does. So through our 2022 World Monuments Watch and this partnership with the Magnum Foundation, we've brought local photographers in to also help tell some of the stories visually of how people relate to these sites, why these sites are important. And of course, particularly with the Hitis, there's a lot of imagery and narrative around the importance of water and these places as community centers. So I think that's helping to enrich, some of this as we really delve into the project. You all have talked about local knowledge, and I think you've shown some really powerful examples of why that's so important. And I think it would be easy to say, well, that local knowledge would be able to manage everything. One, of course, if it weren't dying out, but even if it were still around, if everything stays the same. But we know we have challenges of growing population, particularly in South Asia. And of course, a key thing is climate change, where we have changing rainfall patterns, right? And so many other rising temperatures as well, and other challenges. So I thought, Mohan, I'd love to turn to you to say, how do we develop these projects, implement them, and make sure that we have an impact in the face of climate change, where some of that impact is a little bit unpredictable.
Yeah, this is a great topic because one of the things to deal with climate change is, other than the global understanding and the measures that all the countries would take, essentially it will boil down to two very, very critical issues. One is to address the vulnerabilities at the very, very local level with an enhanced resilience of systems. I won't just say water availability, but all systems put together. And this, using the traditional knowledge system, gives us a great starting point for the idea of decentralization. Because one of the core ideas of local knowledge systems is that they are extremely decentralized. And there is an inherent resilience built into these systems, irrespective of the geography. You mentioned Peru, it could be the same in the Fezzan in Libya, it's the same in the subcontinent, because there was no great reliance on a centralized system, which essentially meant that you could reduce the rates of failure. The rates of failure only increase exponentially the more centralized the system gets. And this is where the local knowledge or the traditional knowledge becomes important, because these are rooted in very specific cultural geographies. I use the term very carefully. It's not just the geography, it's the cultural geography. Jharna mentioned the idea of festivals. They are not the same for every practicing religious person. They are actually informed by the seasonal nature of a space, the crops that are grown, the vegetation that is there. And when these are brought together, that's where the cultural geography and its understanding can actually have one of the biggest impacts on addressing climate change challenges.
Thank you. I think that's, that's a key thing. And we actually have some questions before we officially turn over to the kind of audience questions, but there is a question that ties into this about scale and, can these systems help address the needs of urban areas, kind of large scale. And I think often when we think of at least modern urban settings, we're often thinking of very centralized systems, that work on very large scale. And so how can we use these more localized systems? Can they be used in urban settings? You've all spoken about some urban settings, but how does that work and how do we address that? I don't know if you want to take that, Mohan, or anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there was a very 20th century imagination of a city being a creature which had to be managed centrally, top down. That has changed tremendously across most parts of the world. Even in the idea of governance, there is an increased accent on decentralization, right down to devolution of power to what in the Indian context we call the ward level. So it's no longer decisions being taken at the city or the state level, but at a neighborhood level. And this is where engaging with, whether we want to call them traditional knowledge systems or ancient structures of any kind, means that the community in that area has greater agency for action. So we have all seen the classical engineering that was imposed upon, whether it is for sanitation or water supply, which started great in the 19th century, but had disastrous effects because of the inherent vulnerabilities. And I think, contrary to common perception, conservation and revival of these systems has an even greater role to play in even very dense urban areas. Jharna talked about Kathmandu, we talked about Delhi. In each of these cases, it remains very, very relevant and very critical.
We have yeah, please.
Sorry, Jonathan, can I quickly add to that? A few years ago, we had a workshop in Bidar, which is also in the Deccan, where the Bidar Kanat, the Persian water system channel, was reactivated, and there was a discussion about the Burhanpur water system, which is an elaborate Kanat system, probably one of its kind in the subcontinent. Burhanpur is in Madhya Pradesh. And there the municipal authority wanted to know if it could be revived to benefit the local municipal system, because I believe a part of it was already being used for municipal distribution of water. And there I remember there was a panel of experts from across the world that had collected, and there was a great debate about this. And eventually, most of the people felt that it was not a great idea to take a heritage structure and completely turn it over to the municipal authority, simply because there would be problems there. So I just wanted to point that aspect out as well. Need to be careful.
Yes, go ahead, Jharna, please.
Yes, I was just going to add that, even if this heritage seems like a local and, of importance to the local community, it's actually, you all talked about it before as well, very much connected with what's happening around the world, especially with climate change. And because these are natural systems, right? And then, whatever's happening around the world has a direct impact. For example, the flash floods that's happening now, deforestation, then it impacts the water storage, the intake and the groundwater as well, with the urbanization and all the open spaces turned into, being built up, and all the roads being built with these hard surfaces, and that affects the groundwater. And then, it's an integrated and complicated system that depends on one other. And then also the culture comes in. So, if we lose one, then we lose the others. It's like a domino effect. It does affect everything. So it's not just, it seems local, but it's also connected to the whole world.
Yeah, and I think that ties to, we are going to questions that we have, and we have some fascinating questions in the chat. And there's one that asks about, modern day regulations and oversight of water resources, and how are there challenges kind of meeting those when using some of these traditional or historic systems. And I think you've all highlighted some of the vulnerabilities and challenges of our modern world and some of those systems, but can any of you speak to that? Are there additional considerations as we rehabilitate? And I guess one question too is, as we work on these sorts of system sites, what is really the end use of the water? Are we trying to provide potable water? Is this water for irrigation? What are we aiming to do? So Jharna, I think you have something to say. I'll turn it back to you, and then we'll move around.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I've just started a conservation studio with my students, and we are documenting one of these Hitis. And the students are just fascinated about, the water keeps coming and going. Where does it go? Like, is it being wasted? What are we doing? Are we just conserving the structure, or like this, using the water? And so, yeah, I think that's a very, very, very good. And that's a question that we have to deal with everything. And with each structure and with each system, I think it's a different approach, different users, different different scale as well. So at the end of the day, I think it's the groundwater has to go in, and it just circulates around. So it's a part of the ecosystem, and it has to be not just one user that we can think of. It's from the in order for the Hitis to be flowing, we have to conserve the forests, and then the culture ties in as well. The farmlands have to be irrigated, and the festivals, because of most of the festivals are connected with farming, agriculture as well. So that all ties in. So it's just it's not one thing.
Absolutely. And I think a part of this, of course, is the water quality piece. And we know, unfortunately, this is a big challenge in many parts of the world, but definitely in South Asia, it's something that we face and struggle with. And I wonder, Mohan, if you might have some thoughts about that, just in terms of, in the projects that we're working on together, the end use of the water, but also how we're going to try to deal with that water quality piece, which of course has a major social component.
True. This was an important question, and I've been reading this also in the chat and the Q&A section. So first off, it's wrong to assume that this is simply going to be a replacement for an engineered technology. This is going to augment the capacity of the larger region, the natural capacity, and how we then leverage that resource for different uses remains with us. So this is not to say that if a city municipality is supplying you drinking water quality in your taps, it's not that I will simply turn off the tap and expect another source to come in. But what it does is that because there are so many interrelated issues, earlier traditional water systems worked in a particular way. There was no chemical contamination, there was no sewage inflow, and so on. Those are definitely challenges that we need to be aware of. And as far as the quality and for what it is used for, I will repeat that it is not merely a replacement for bottled water, if I can give an extreme example, but definitely the availability of such a water means that we forget that there is a very large diversity of uses and demands on even urban water systems. We forget the need for, cattle, which actually forms a very, very large demand. It could be for washing, it could be for cleaning, it could be for cultural purposes, it could be for recreational purposes. Drinking water is only a very, very small component of the larger water demand that we have. So I would really not, to use a really bad metaphor, not throw the baby out with the bathwater in this case to say the quality is not meeting up to drinking water standards, but we will need to evolve systems that actually caters to the bulk of the demand.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I have to say, I've loved the water puns throughout this. Adds a bit of color to the conversation. We are really coming right up to the end. And so before we wrap up, a few things that I wanted to bring up, and also maybe one last question. Well, first, there's a question asking how many are we? And what I'm seeing is we've been over 100 people this entire time. So that's great. We have an audience, and they seem to be from really all over the world. Definitely a lot of South Asian representation, which is fantastic. But also I see names I recognize in Europe and US, so wonderful. And I wanted to close out with a broader question that is more about us, to be quite honest, and WMF, but I saw this question in the chat too, and Yaaminey, it was about the watch and the fact that you were involved in putting a nomination together for those historic water systems, the Deccan Plateau. And so just wonder if you could say a few words about that experience and what you think the benefits of being involved in the watch are.
I think that, well, first of all, I'd like to start with a disclaimer that I put together that nomination in 2019. And thereafter, I left for this Fulbright assignment, and then the pandemic happened. So it was, a series of, disastrous occurrences, which sort of made the site a little inaccessible. Having said that, I think that it's given a lot of visibility. It's certainly put the site on a map, maybe opened a window to looking at the area. And then, that Daulatabad has also been called Khadki, which means a window in the local language. So maybe Daulatabad is fulfilling its role as a window to looking at the Deccan and other Deccan water sites. It is a difficult site to work on, that much I can tell you. I mean, ASI, Archaeological Survey of India, between them and the district administration, it's really hard to get a hold of who, one can approach in order to work on the site. But one very a significant activity that could be done is simply awareness raising, maybe through documentation and maybe through visual documentation, looking at it from a larger regional perspective, maybe looking at it even as an educational tool to see how the landscape interacts with the human communities and how historically human communities have used the terrain and topography in order to develop these kind of water systems.
Absolutely.
While I'm not sure when we will be able to revive it, if at all,
Right.
but I think there's a lot to learn from it.
Absolutely. And we had a lot of questions too that we didn't quite get to about how do we integrate these things into the education system? How do we make sure younger generations know not just about the importance of water, but also these traditional ways of water management that were quite successful and can be again. So
I can answer some on email if you wish.
yes,
later.
that would be great. And I think, and I know people have also asked for papers and references. So just to say, we'll be sending some materials out. I know this recording will also be available online, but unfortunately we've already run over and we do have to come to the end. And I have a few final words that I need to get through before we close out. But I want to first of all, of course, thank all of you for being here today. All three of our panelists for sharing their experience, their expertise, and their perspective on the role of water and the role that heritage also plays around that kind of management of that very important resource. And of course, in our lives as human beings, which is really critical. So this area of work, of course, is very important to WMF, and it's a part of our portfolio that I know the whole team is really excited about, particularly because we feel that through some of this, we can make a contribution to building climate resilience and also addressing other modern issues that really are facing communities everywhere. Now, before I end, I do want to recognize some of our funders, our donors for the projects that we mentioned. And I think we'll have a slide come up. So I'd like to thank all of the supporters for the projects we mentioned today. Leadership support for WMF's projects to rehabilitate historic water systems of India has been provided by TCS Foundation, and we're grateful to them. WMF's work at the Hitis of Kathmandu Valley is made possible in part by the Watch Committee of World Monuments Fund, American Express, and also the Tianadera Foundation, Nellie and Robert Gibson. So thank you all very much for your support. We wouldn't be able to do any of this without that support. And of course, to everyone who attended today, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you were as inspired and excited by the conversation as I was. I know I learned a lot. There's much more for all of us to learn together, and we're very excited to really dig into these projects and continue that learning and continue to spread that knowledge. So thank you all. I encourage everyone to follow us on social media, join us at WMF.org to find more about these projects and other of our work. I know there's some information in the chat also for all of you to click on. So we will send that information, and there'll be a recording of this that will also be available. I hope to see all of you next time at our next event. This is part of a series, and I want to wish everyone a wonderful day or evening, depending where you are. Thanks again, and goodbye.
Thank you.